Right. So thank you, Feria Fuar, for giving me this opportunity. I'm Damas. I'm the team lead for integrated water management at IC Impact, and I'm joining you online from Quebec City. And as you know, this will continue for some years, even years to come. But because yesterday I just heard from our Canadian Chief Public Health Officer that even if the COVID-19 vaccine is developed, mask wearing, physical distancing could be in place for 2 or 3 years to come. So this pandemic has really changed a lot of the way we live and work. I would like to thank you, the student engagement community, for giving me the distinct honor of introducing our keynote speaker for this special IC Impact WESTalks webinar in the framework of the IC Impact 2020 Research Conference. Now, what WESTalks stands for? It stands for Water and Environment Student Talk. It's a collaborative initiative by IC Impact Student Engagement Committee and the University of British Columbia Fisher Waters, and it's being hosted jointly by the student at UBC and McGill University. WESTalks brings together over 1,000 leaders on sustainable water and environment research from around the world, and students interested in making a difference. Now, what is the IC Impact? Just before we start, we're chatting with our keynote speaker, who was asking what the acronym stands for. And maybe many of us don't know exactly what it stands for. It is India-Canada Center for Innovative Multidisciplinary Partnership to Accelerate Community Transformation and Sustainability. It is the first and only Canada-India Research Center of Excellence established through the Canadian Network Center of Excellence to develop research collaboration between India and Canada in 3 themes, namely safe and sustainable infrastructure, public health, and water resources management. And yesterday, as we have heard from our CEO, there may be some other theme to come, including the agri-tech. This Pan-Canadian Center hosted at UBC brings together researchers, industry, innovators, community leaders, government agency, and community organization from across India and Canada to work hand in hand to find solution to the key challenges that affect the quality of life of millions of people in Indian and Canadian communities. The UBC Future Waters is a new UBC Research Excellence cluster on the future state of water. It focuses on interdisciplinary research at the intersection of law, policy, and governance, and the applied and biophysical science of water. Now, our team here, the WESTalks Organizing Committee members, they are brilliant students, motivated and engaged. You can see on the left side here, Fuar Dixit, Abhishek Dutta, and we have also Carl, and we do have also the postdoc Jaskaran at McGill University. And I want to say, when I say brilliant, motivated and engaged student, as a matter of fact, these 3 students are recipients of the Canada most prestigious scholarship, Vanier. And as you know, this team is supported by our outstanding executive assistant, Feria, in the middle here. And I was also curious to see, and of course, proud to see that those 3 students are IC. Those Vanier scholars, they are IC impact students, and it looks like they are all going to UBC. Now, this team has put together a lineup almost a dozen of unique seminars. And we had our first seminar on July 9th from Dr. Christophe Luthi, who is working for the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology. So they are altogether about 12 of those seminars that we'll be having. And today I will have the pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. So today's speaker is Dr. Paul Westerhoff. He is a Regent Professor at the university, at Arizona State University, and the Fulton Environmental Chair of Environmental Engineering. I joined the Arizona State University in 1995, and after serving as the chair of the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department, he was the founding director for the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment. Since then, he has served as Associate Dean of Research in Engineering, Vice Provost for Academic Programming, and Vice Dean for Research and Innovation in Engineering. So please, and his talk today, I would like to join me to give a big and massive applause for Professor Paul Westerhoff. So from now, Professor Paul, Paul Westerhoff, I will pass you the floor. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction. So somebody needs to give me permission to share my screen. There we go.
Yeah, I stopped it.
Great, thank you. Great, I very much appreciate this opportunity to learn about IC impacts and give a talk. And so there's a bunch of these QR codes here. So I want to try to make this a little bit interactive. So I've set it up on something called slido.com. So you can either scan the QR code in the upper right-hand corner, or just go to slido.com and type in this, this event code. And you'll see it a couple times, but I only set up 3 or 4 simple questions, and we'll take a look at the results either live or at the end. So thank you very much, Fuhar, for inviting me. And I gave him an option of different titles, and this is the one he picked that is thinking about something called Defacto Wastewater Reuse, and really thinking about asking a question: are we drinking treated wastewater, and to what extent, and how can we think about using large data systems to answer kind of large spatial questions? So here's kind of an outline. I only have a few slides on each. I'll talk for about 25 minutes or so, so we have a lot of question and answer time, hopefully. I'll start off by defining what de facto reuse is, and then kind of going through an illustration of how we use kind of data. And again, the QR or the code got cut off, but if you use that QR code, you'll get to these questions. So the first is, what do I mean by de facto reuse? And so here's a little animation, in it here, that we have cities located upstream. And if you follow the little bouncing dot, the water goes through the cities and changed colors as it went through. So everyone would like to live in city number 1 or city number 2, but your number 1 and your number 2 goes to the wastewater treatment plant and then goes into a stream. And so city number 3 is definitely impacted by what's called unplanned reuse or unintentional reuse, or what I'm calling de facto reuse. And as I go through today, I'll kind of quantify it, but if you have a glass of water, what it means is that some percentage of it is water of wastewater origin, and it's treated wastewater, right? So it meets standards and different things, but we know that, you know, treated wastewater can itself carry inorganic things like ammonia. It can carry pharmaceutical residuals, and it can carry some pathogens potentially. So when I talk about water of wastewater origin or de facto reuse, the way we kind of got here thinking about this is we used to go out and sample for every chemical you could ever imagine. But we quickly realized that doing so was a lot of work. Doing so was only valid on that day that we were there sampling. And we didn't really understand how to extrapolate from tens or dozens of sampling points to understand, you know, kind of what is the exposure risk from wastewater on a national scale. So this de facto reuse serves as kind of a surrogate for all these other things that we know are in treated wastewater effluents. So we've started and we published a number of different papers. For this group, I wanted to do not just the technical side, but this is some work that we did with a social scientist where we actually asked over 1,000 people in 3 different cities in the United States, do they know that their water at their home contains treated wastewater? And it's not surprising, right? So over half the people said, I don't know, 50 to 60%. You know, some people said yes, some people said no, and these were social scientists kind of driving the question, so they understood how to ask these questions. And then we also asked them, well, if you have wastewater there, water of wastewater origin, what would be an acceptable amount? So you can see a very interesting distribution here. Some people said 100% on the far right is acceptable. Some people said 0, and there's only a few in between. So it turned out when we kind of asked these people, the people who knew kind of about what I'll call kind of, you know, hydrology in kind of the Anthropocene, or what is the impact of people on hydrology in terms of water infrastructure, the people who knew that we had wastewater in our drinking water were much more acceptable to have a high degree of de facto reuse. So we had defined these terms, but what it really says is that knowledge is the information that people need to be able to make informed decisions about things. So hopefully you understand kind of de facto reuse is a surrogate. De facto reuse can be thought of as describing hydrology to people. Now, the next question is here, you know, how did we calculate de facto reuse? And we did this across the entire country, the United States, but we've done very similar things in China, in the Yangtze River Basin. Other people have done things similar now in Japan and Germany. But we developed a model called DRINKS, de facto reuse incidents in our nation's consumable supply. And these are layers of ArcGIS data. So we have layers of all the rivers in the United States that are broken down into hydrological units. Every wastewater treatment plant in the United States, and there's over 15,000 of these, and each of these discharge to surface waters. And all the surface water drinking water plants. And so this is a fraction of them, but these are the larger ones. But we've modeled all of them now, over 14,000 surface water plants. And so this is a very large data set. We don't only know the location of them. We know, you know, where they discharge or take water from. We know how many people they serve. We know the types of treatment technology within them. So we have a large data set on each of these. So we'd use this information to develop these models. And at least in the United States, the US EPA, who you would think would have this information, our Environmental Protection Agency, actually comes to us and partners with us because we were the first people to really integrate all this data on a national scale. And we integrated this within a Python language and ArcGIS framework. So ArcGIS can store locations and information, Python is a modeling system that allows us to, route water, be able to answer questions and process the data. So how did we calculate this de facto reuse? So essentially the stream network was broken up into a series of nodes, and we'd have, different symbols representing junction of different rivers coming together, whether they're wastewater treatment plants or drinking water plants. And then we use this and just kind of added up the cumulative amount of wastewater as it went downstream. So this is really important because a lot of the drinking water plants are impacted not by one, but by dozens or even hundreds of upstream wastewater treatment plants. So there's a way to kind of just do a mass balance along the way. All right, so that's kind of how we, took data to develop a framework to understand the question, how much wastewater is in our rivers? And so hopefully you're doing that Slido poll, and you can, we'll look at your results in a little bit. So at the simplest level, we published this paper in, the reference didn't show up in Nature Geoscience, but this is just looking at every wastewater treatment plant in the United States and where it discharges water and into what type of a river it does it. So the color of the rivers here are color-coded as to how much dilution, net dilution is occurring in these rivers. So the redder the line means there's less dilution. So this is very important for fish and ecological impacts of things like endocrine disruptors that are discharged into these rivers that have an effect on the ecosystem. So this dilution factor is very simple. It's the flow in the river divided by the cumulative flow of the wastewater. So higher dilution factors are good. Dilution is the solution to a lot of these problems. It's the old way of thinking about things. But, across the United States, at least, wastewater discharges make up 50% of the in-stream flow during average flow conditions for over 900 streams. So wastewater is important if you want to have a river with water in these streams, for sure. So if we go a level deeper, kind of looking at that pretty picture to think about these dilution factors and bar and whisker statistical approaches, but the middles of these bars, are showing kind of the averages. And you can see in these different hydrologic units, the typical dilution factors are between 2 and about, 50 or so. So that means that, when you have wastewater in a river, it's making up, single digit to tens of percent of the stream flow. So what does this mean in terms of a fish if you're living in the river? Well, you can look at any individual compound, and here we looked at 3 different endocrine disruptors as kind of identified here. And these red lines show essentially a dilution factor that would get to below a hazard risk or hazard quotient for these. And you can see that for what are called low stream orders versus high stream orders, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but a high stream order are really large rivers. In the United States, it's the Colorado River, the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, really large rivers. And you can see that they have really high dilution factors. That is, the dilution factor is higher than the red line, so it's not going to pose risk. It's what are called low stream orders, where you're in the same order of magnitude as this hazard quotient, and these would pose risk to fish. So I'll talk about these stream orders a little bit more in a minute, but just remember that low stream orders pose higher risk to fish, at least. Now let's think about people instead of the fish, and then we'll come back and look at this again. So across the United States, we've looked at all the drinking water intakes, and there's a really high frequency of occurrence in these different hydrologic units, the number of treatment plants. But if you look at the green bars here, the green bars represent the percent of the water plants impacted by at least one upstream wastewater plant. So on average, it's about 50% of the drinking water plants in the United States are impacted by at least one upstream wastewater plant. These are scattered across the country. It's not just in arid regions of the country. So all these symbols represent surface water treatment plants that serve more than 10,000 people that have impacts by at least one upstream wastewater plant. And the color and size of the circles, represents, so 20% de facto reuse means 20% of the water coming into that drinking water plant can be of wastewater origin. And so you can look in Texas down here, for example, and the south central part of the country, but really across the country, you can have this de facto reuse occurring. It's not isolated to just one part of the country. This is for larger cities. This is for smaller cities that serve less than 10,000 people. And likewise, you can see it's distributed across the entire country. So it doesn't matter if you're a large city, small city, anywhere in the country, if you're using surface water, you have a pretty high risk of using it. However, the magnitude of this de facto reuse is pretty low. Most of these circles are less than 1% of the water is of wastewater origin. So what does that mean? 1% means that a pharmaceutical and wastewater effluent is diluted 100 times, or 1% of it. So you might go from 500 nanograms per liter to 5 nanograms per liter of some of these compounds. So about 100x. But you can see as these higher wastewater impacts, you're only about 5x dilution. So what does this mean in terms of where you are? I showed that spatially there's not a big effect, but there can be temporal effects. And these temporal or throughout the year seasonal effects really depend upon the type of river that your drinking water plant is located on. So there's something called the Strahler stream order. And what this is if you have two small streams at the headwaters of a basin that come together, they start off as first order. When two first order streams come together, it's a second order stream. Two second order streams come together, third, so on. And so as I said, these high stream orders of 8 and 9, or the Columbia River, really large river systems. So remember I said that the fish in small stream orders are more at risk of those endocrine disruptors. And so these are the smaller streams, there's less dilution available for them. So let's see how that plays out for this de facto reuse. So the y-axis here is de facto reuse. This represents about 20, all the different lines or different water treatment plants. And the x-axis here is historic percent stream flow. So P50 is a median stream flow, average stream flow. P90 is kind of higher stream flows, kind of flooding. So you can see as you get to these higher stream flows, the de facto reuse decreases. But a P10 around something called a 7Q10, or 7-day low flow that occurs about every 2 years, is about a P10, it's called. And this is what a lot of streams are regulated on. And so you can see it's something, a week-long drought that might happen once every 2 years. You can see a lot of these systems have higher de facto reuse during these lower flow, and some of them are almost 100% water of wastewater origin. All of these are from Texas, a pretty dry state. But you can see now you have almost no dilution. So people are drinking a very large amount of water of wastewater origin. Another way to look at that same thing is to look at throughout a year, that you have periods of the year with high flow and low flow. So for these ones on top, in September, October is the low flow period. So you end up with more water of wastewater origin. There's less dilution available. So you can see that there's seasonality in this. And so it also reinforces the idea, if I went out and sampled to see if there were endocrine disruptors in drinking water, I wouldn't want to know this information and really maybe pick the worst case, that is when the stream flows at the lowest, go out in the late fall to maybe sample these. So this type of modeling allows you to develop and design where to sample and when to sample. So we've been able to kind of validate these predictions. We've got a lot of questions about this. So there's different ways to validate it, different data sets, but as I said, there's only a limited amount of data out there. So one way we did this is in the United States, there's something called the UCMR, Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule. So they went out and measured hormones, estrogen, androgen, and testosterone. And these are, human hormones. And these are at drinking water plants. And so if it has a colored dot there, that means that they detected these hormones above the detection limit. And the black dot means they were sampled for, but they were not detected. The red numbers represent our predictions of de facto reuse. So what you see is that at every colored dot, we predicted some de facto reuse. And at every black dot, we said there was no de facto reuse. So there's no kind of false positives or false negatives here. We're able to predict every time they detected these hormones. So this is one method of kind of validation. We've worked, I'm not going to go through the details here, with the US EPA and US Geological Survey to kind of validate this in other ways as well. All right, so what does all this mean in terms of the implications of this work? So if we focus in on one state, Texas, and this does have pretty high levels of this de facto reuse. It's a pretty dry or arid state. And so 2/3 of the surface water treatment plants in Texas are impacted by at least one upstream plant. And then again, the size and color of the circle tells you, how much water of wastewater origin is there. So there's a lot of wastewater. One is if there was no wastewater, they might not have enough water to drink, but they clearly have water of wastewater origin. So all the things you think about as risk factors in there are present. And just to show you the complexity of these types of things, this is one river basin in California. This has 10 water treatment plants. And I think there was something like 25 or 30 wastewater treatment plants. So there's no one answer. And so if you're way down here at drinking water treatment plant number 1, you're impacted by every wastewater plant upstream. But some of them are a mile or two away, some are tens of kilometers, and some are hundreds of kilometers. So we were able to use this type of analysis, add it up, and look at travel times in these rivers. And it turns out that, even across this entire basin here, it takes less than about 7 or 10 days for water to move through this basin. So that might seem like a long time or a short time, but in terms of degradation of pharmaceuticals and other things, it's a relatively short time. So this allows us to understand how these things can transform in the river systems. And this gives you some idea of these distributions of these distances upstream. Again, up to hundreds of kilometers, but that represents days to 1 or 2 weeks of travel time. All right, so that's what comes into the water treatment plants. But that's not so bad, because we have water treatment, and it's supposed to remove compounds that we care about in water. So this graph shows for different, on the x-axis, different size communities. So on the far right, large cities serving over 100,000 people. And these are numbers and ranges that the US EPA kind of puts size of treatment plants into. The y-axis is the percent of water treatment plants that fit into each of these different boxes. And so there's 4 kind of bars kind of integrated in here. So let's look closely at them. The first 2 that are stacked bars, the black one and the shaded one, or the hash barred one, are impacted by de facto reuse. The shaded one, for these small plants, that is impacted by wastewater reuse, but it doesn't have advanced drinking water technologies. So it does not have them. So what does that mean? There's no ozone, no activated carbon, no membranes, things that could remove pharmaceuticals, for example. So what you see is in these, that kind of hash barred one here, is that most of the plants do not have advanced treatment technologies, and they are impacted by wastewater. In fact, as you go to the left here, you see bigger bars, and this represents the small communities actually have a higher risk of being impacted by de facto reuse, and they lack the technology to remove them. So these types of models that we're developing allow us to look at trends and patterns in all the treatment plants across not only Texas, but across the entire United States, to say, if we were to invest in advanced treatment technologies to prevent exposure to pharmaceuticals, here are the locations, here are how many treatment plants we should be addressing. So kind of where are we going with this, to kind of summarize what we've done? We've done the United States now for all the surface water plants. We've done things similar in Germany and Japan and parts of China. what we want to do now is to move beyond wastewater contributions. We know that agricultural runoff, for example, has things like nitrate, ammonia, herbicides, pesticides. And we want to then also integrate, energy production systems. For example, this map here shows the geospatial location of different types of power generation. So they discharge other types of contaminants. We're also looking at, here I talked mostly about chemicals in water, but we're moving in this age of coronavirus, but really looking at all the emerging biological agents that could be in wastewater. Not just living organisms, but also biological agents that are fragments of living molecules that can look at transforming the genetic code of organisms in river systems or downstream. The most prevalent one being things like antibiotic-resistant genes. So once these are present in wastewater, they can impact things downstream. So we want to understand, where should people be looking for them? Where should we be integrating technologies to protect river systems, protect fish, ecological systems, as well as protecting downstream people. So we call this kind of idea of using data more than sampling kind of water IT, or water information technology. So hopefully I kept us on time there. And I'd like to acknowledge funding we've had from our National Science Foundation Center and other sources, as well as folks in my lab, and the two folks here on the bottom, Jocelyn Rice and Thuy Nguyen up on top from Vietnam. And I think Thuy was online today, actually, that they've contributed a lot of the data and analysis that's in here that I get to present. So if you still need the code for the Slido, I'll have to pull it back up here in a moment. It looks like it got cut off. But with that, I'd like to open it up and answer any questions. Hopefully you can see the code there.